Okay, so on January 3rd, 2026, the world basically woke up to a massive geopolitical earthquake. The capture of Venezuela's president sent shockwaves across the entire globe. And in this explainer, we're going to break down what this huge event means, specifically for India.
And just to give you a sense of how high the stakes really are, listen to this. This is a statement from the US president, made right after the operation. You see, this isn't just about one country. It's a signal of a much, much more aggressive American foreign policy. So what exactly happened?
Here's the quick rundown of how the first 72 hours went down. It all kicks off on January 3rd. U.S. forces launched something called Operation Absolute Resolve and capture President Maduro. Just a day later, he and his wife are flown to New York to face narco-terrorism charges. We're talking allegations of using drug money for political ends. Back in Venezuela, his vice president is sworn in as the interim leader. And by the 6th, the world has started to choose sides. Russia and China are calling it a kidnapping, while India expresses deep concern.
All right, so let's zoom in on the operation itself. Operation Absolute Resolve.
You know, the one word everyone is using to describe this is precision. U.S. Special Forces carried out what's being called a surgical raid right in the heart of Caracas. Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, were taken, and now they're in the U.S. facing these really serious charges. Of course, they're pleading not guilty, calling the whole thing a kidnapping. But this single, swift action is what kicked off all this immediate global chaos.
And that brings us to the global aftershocks and how this one event is spiraling into a much bigger international story.
The world is, well, it's clearly divided on this one. You've got Venezuela's new government trying to find its feet, while America's biggest rivals, Russia and China, are crying foul. The neighbors, Brazil and Colombia, are on high alert, totally worried about the whole region becoming unstable. Critics are bringing up the old Monroe Doctrine, fearing we're seeing a return to U.S. interventionism in Latin America. And right in the middle of it all, you have India playing its cards very carefully, just issuing a statement of deep concern.
But, and this is where things get really fascinating, amid all of this geopolitical turmoil, there's an unexpected silver lining, and it's a big one, specifically for India. This gets us to the core of our explainer, the potential economic windfall. It really all starts with this number, $1 billion. For years, India's state-owned oil company, ONGC Videsh, has had over $1 billion in payments just stuck in Venezuela, completely out of reach. With a new government potentially looking for international partners, that money could finally come home. That is a massive win for India. And the good news for India's energy security doesn't stop there. First off, Indian companies can finally restart their stalled oil projects in Venezuela's Orinoco Belt. Second, if Venezuela's huge oil reserves come back online, that flood of supply could mean cheaper crude oil globally, which is huge for a country that imports over 80% of its oil. And third, it gives them a new source of the heavy crude that Indian refineries are literally built for, which means less reliance on Russia.
Now, to put this into perspective, analysts are predicting a potential 4 to 5% drop in global crude prices once things stabilize. Now, that might not sound like a lot, right? But for a country with an import bill over $100 billion, a drop from, say, $80 to $76 a barrel, we're talking about billions of dollars in savings for the Indian economy.
And the benefits don't just stop with oil. This thing has positive ripple effects. Think about Indian pharmaceutical companies. They can now get paid in stable US dollars instead of messing with barter systems. Indian construction firms could get a piece of the pie rebuilding the country's infrastructure. And hey, even farmers back in India could feel this because more Venezuelan gas on the market could lower global fertilizer prices, which eases the burden on the government.
Okay, so the economic upside is pretty clear. But every major geopolitical event has two sides, right? And this brings us to the immense challenge India now faces, walking this incredibly tricky geopolitical tightrope. And it all boils down to this fundamental question. For decades, India has built its foreign policy on this idea of strategic autonomy, being a friend to all but an ally to none. This event, driven by a very decisive U.S. action, puts that entire doctrine to the test.
Let's just break down the dilemma here. On the one hand, if India leans more towards the US, the perks could be huge. We're talking better trade deals, access to advanced defense tech, and a lot more diplomatic muscle on the world stage. But the risks? They're just as big. It could seriously undermine that strategic autonomy they value so much, hurt their leadership role in the global South, and make other partners really nervous about American influence.
Beyond those big strategic questions, there are some very immediate concerns. the biggest short-term worry is oil price volatility. Before prices potentially fall, the initial chaos could cause a really painful spike. Add to that the risk of diplomatic backlash, pressure on the Indian rupee, and even higher shipping costs in the Caribbean. These are all things New Delhi has to manage, like, right now.
So with all these competing factors in play, all these forces pulling in different directions, what happens next? What is India's path forward?
So here's the bottom line. Let's put it all on the table. The potential gains are crystal clear. Getting back over $1 billion, getting cheaper energy, opening up new trade. But the risks are just as stark. Short-term price spikes, a really difficult diplomatic balancing act, and market volatility. The real challenge for India is going to be navigating all these risks to actually realize those immense gains.
Ultimately, this single event does way more than just affect oil prices. It fundamentally changes the entire landscape. It forces India to operate in a world where bold American interventionism is a major factor again, and that directly challenges the country's long-held policy of staying strategically neutral.
And that leaves us with one big question for the future. In this world of renewed American assertiveness, with these huge potential benefits and massive risks on the table, where does a rising power like India draw the line?